All right, so let's answer these. Why does NASA have a working definition of life? And what is a working definition of life? Well, a working definition of life is a definition that changes as we learn more. It's not a script. It's not a definition that you have to fit other things into. The definition fits the circumstances rather than the other way around. No, that's very useful when you're going into. And why does NASA have to have it? Because NASA is exploring unknowns. It's exploring unknown space. I've never been there. Don't know what it's like. I have no idea what we're going to find. So you have to have something to really wrap your mind around. Some define life as properties of life as we know it. The list of properties typically includes organization, metabolism, homeostasis, growth, reproduction, response, evolution. What are each of these properties? All right, I've already described them earlier in a previous video in this series, so you guys can go back and look at those. But each of these properties help define life. And homeostasis we covered well over the last 2 weeks. And growth, getting bigger, growing more cells, the cell itself enlarging in some cases. Reproduction in single-celled organisms, that is. Reproduction, making more of oneself. Response to the environment, evolution, we've talked about a little bit. Organization, we talked about a lot. And metabolism, right? The counter examples for each of these properties, other than those discussed in text. All right, so what would the counter example be? So this is if you have a form of life that gives you, you might say, well, let me show you reproduction. Humans reproduce. Well, what's an example? That would be an example of how humans are alive. Well, is there an example that's opposite that? Some kind of counter example that says, well, look, there are, for instance, yes, humans do reproduce, therefore humans are alive, but what about someone who can't reproduce? Are they not alive? So that would be an example of a counter argument. An example would be a liger, which is a combination of a tiger and a lion coming together having babies. They're sterile, they're ligers, they're alive, but they cannot reproduce. And growth, bacteria generally don't grow very large. They grow somewhat larger, so I suppose they're still growing technically when they first divide. But although they reproduce, they don't really grow the way humans do. We grow very big. We go from one single cell to trillions of cells. We grow large. We're in our mother's womb. We grow as a mother's belly grows as we grow. And then we're born, and then we keep growing until we're full adults. Bacteria don't do that. So bacterial growth would be slightly different than what we would be used to with multicellular growth. And there's a lot of answers here. I'm just giving you some of the examples, so you might have already written one that's right. But metabolism, I don't know of any exceptions to metabolism on planet Earth. All things process energy. All things on Earth are organized. Reproduction, we've already talked about. Homeostasis, all things keep homeostasis. to my knowledge, there's no life on Earth that doesn't have feedback mechanisms that allow it to keep homeostasis. I mean, one possible except not really an exception, but kind of a different way of handling things, or what used to be called cold-blooded, no, homeotherms versus heterotherms, right? But let's call them cold-blooded because you might have heard of that term. Cold-blooded organisms are not able to regulate their own temperature. They don't have those feedback mechanisms that mammals do. They do regulate their body temperature, though, by behavior. They go sit in the sun when they get cold. They go in the shade when they get too hot. So they do keep homeostasis. They don't have the internal feedback mechanisms to do that. So they're slightly different, but still they do homeostasis. So it's not really something you can really say it isn't a counterexample. Evolution, as far as we know, all populations evolve, but individuals do not evolve. So as far as we can tell, every species that's in existence today has some kind of evolutionary history that we've identified. I say we, I mean humans, have identified as an example of evolution. So yeah, I'm just trying to think of, is there a counterexample for evolution? Really, there's none that I can think of. All right, so I would say that like these would be the counterexamples of these properties. Oh, this dog just keeps moving on me. He's laying on top of me. He won't budge. Sorry, buddy. This ongoing debate over whether viruses are considered living or not. What's the argument for and against classifying viruses as living organisms? Well, it's pretty simple. Viruses. So virus, again, we'll talk about it more later. I'm just drawing right now kind of a simplistic diagram of a virus. I'm sure you've seen the COVID virus with the spike proteins sticking out of it in the news. So the main argument, and you could have looked all this stuff up. But the main arguments for a virus not being alive is that it's, number one, not alive. The main arguments for not being alive, it's not a cell. Most don't have cell membranes, so they're not really cells, although some do. So that's one reason that's a 4. Some do have membranes. They do evolve, as you can see when you look at the different viruses, COVID viruses, the different versions. What you're looking at when you hear different variants, those are that's the evolution of viruses. That happens very quickly in the virus population because they multiply very quickly, and there's a lot of them at each reproductive event, and they're constantly reproducing. But they're not able to reproduce They're not able to reproduce alone. Within their own, on their own, they don't have any mechanisms, no machinery required to reproduce. because they're not a cell. I mean, the key components are not cells, so they can't do the things that cells do. They're not able to process energy. They do evolve, and they do have DNA or RNA, so they do have inheritable material that they do pass on from one generation to the next. Uh, they don't react to the environment. Most. They don't grow. Um, they do have organization, though. Now, everything I'm listing is the stuff that most viruses don't. So I'm not going to tell you. I'm not an expert. I'm not a virologist. I'm sure there's viruses that break these examples, but the bottom line is that because of this long list of things that support it not being alive, a lot of people don't consider them alive. They consider them bits of information, heritable information that get passed along. They usually have a protein code, or some of them have membranes. They have RNA or DNA, but certainly they do not. They do not. Certainly, they don't do any of this on their own. They don't have any machinery inside them, the way your cells, my cells, even bacterial cells have, to do all these things that we consider are part of life. They do almost nothing on their own. They get taken in by our cells or by the infected individual, and it's the infected individual that does all the work. All right. So that's why or why not. Suppose you analyze data from a spacecraft visiting one of the moons of the solar system, and you identify a virus there. Would you argue you find extraterrestrial life? Why or why not? Why not, or why not? Huh. That's a tough one. I mean, if there's a virus, if you found a virus on an extraterrestrial planet, right, it had to have a host, because it would have to have machinery that allowed it to reproduce. So even if you don't argue that it's alive, even if you argue it's not alive, something had to make that virus. Something had to make that DNA or that RNA, that stuff that defines who we are, right? And the stuff that we got from our parents and our parents' parents, et cetera, all the way back to Adam and Eve. How did that extraterrestrial virus, where did it come from? So if you identify a virus there, even though it may not be alive, it must have come from something that was. So that would be the answer to that question. A little bit tricky on that one. What is a habitable zone, and why is the finding of Earth-like planets in a habitable zone important in search of life in the universe? Well, habitable zone is, again, that Goldilocks area, the distance from the sun, the amount of water on the planet, the distance from the sun is one of the key components, because if it's too close, it's going to be way too hot to sustain life. Again, this is really important as we know it. To sustain life as we know it. it has to be a certain distance from the sun. For instance, you go to Mercury and it would be boiling seas of lava. How is any life that we know of going to live on Mercury? Pluto, although it's a planetoid, it used to be called a planet, or even it's a small planetoid that's so far away from the sun, it's incredibly cold and receives very little sunlight. So no energy, as we know it, could really help sustain that planet's life. So there must have, if there is life on Pluto, it must be very different. The energy must come from somewhere or something else. Saturn is a gas giant, and it's medium distance from the sun. Uh, it's mostly gas, and the rest, and we're not even sure what's at the center, but the pressures and the gravity of the planet would crush anything on planet Earth. So there are the planets the right size, the right distance from the sun, the right amount of water, the right amount of oxygen that could support life as we know it. And so this is the habitable zone. All right, give examples of what the text calls exotic life. So life that is not like that on Earth. Life that is based on silicon, right? Life based on energy. Artificial intelligence at some point could become self-aware. Do you call it life? I don't know. Again, a working definition. Maybe you don't. You don't call it life. I mean, even if you believe in spirits and such, is a spirit alive? Right? Doesn't have a body. So there it is. In addition to the Joyce working definition of life, NASA also uses the Coleman definition, which states that life is self-organized system capable of processing energy sources to its advantage. By the way, self-organized, you see that? The self-organized system processing energy. Virus is not self-organized. It's organized by your cells or by the host. Everything about it is put together by the host. It doesn't do any of that on its own. Again, I'm talking about most viruses. Are there exceptions? I'm not sure. So this definition would not include viruses. And it's not able to process energy to its advantage. The cell that it invades processes the energy to make it happen. What are the main differences between the two? So when you're thinking of Joyce, you're thinking of James Joyce. And when you think of James Joyce, you have to consider what he wrote. He wrote this amazing novel that's read, oh gosh, I'm assuming in college. You might, I don't know if you read it in high school. It's one of the great literary novels of our time, of humanity, really. It's the story of Ulysses. And in the book, he explores what it means to be alive. And really the key here is this idea that the working definition of life in Ulysses is a complex, multifaceted concept that encompasses entirely human existence, right? The entirety of human existence, right? So it looks at what is it to be human. So it's kind of defining what it means to be human, but really the It's this idea of being a stream of consciousness. That's what Joyce considers being alive. So in James Joyce's version or definition of life, then something like artificial intelligence could have a stream of consciousness if it developed self-awareness and therefore could be considered alive. All right. So what physical principles do you think a definition of life should include? Before reading part 2, which principles would you suggest and why? This is really an answer that just has to do with whether you're able to support your answer with evidence. What some possible right answers might be something like organization, and therefore the 3 dots means therefore, and a decrease in entropy and a decrease in chaos. I think that's certainly something that is undeniable, right? It has to be, life is organized no matter what you look at. There has to be organization. Probably another one that it should definitely include would be somehow the processing of matter and energy. Right? So some kind of metabolism. What that looks like, even on Earth, it's very complicated. There's chemosynthetic organisms at the bottom of the ocean that use volcanic vents to do chemistry to create order from disorder. Obviously, we as humans eat animals or plants to get the energy that we need to create order from disorder. Plants use the sun's energy and the matter around them to create order from disorder. So at least I think these two seem to be two that we can pretty much all agree on. I think that the definition of life is in a spiritual sense, an idea of the kind of a non-physical form. It's valid. It's certainly something to think about, but I'm not sure how you would identify that. It would be difficult. And then, of course, AI would be another artificial intelligence, and that's a whole nother discussion that would be kind of crazy. So really what you're looking at, in my opinion, these two are going to be key. Of course, you could talk about some of the others, like reproduction, being able to reproduce themselves, to grow, to respond to the environment, that kind of thing.